Chinese new national security law. Banks could also be penalized for those doing business with these individuals. China firmly opposes and strongly condemns the move of the U.S. side of signing the so-called Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and has summoned the U.S. ambassador in Beijing to launch an official protest. To analyze all these latest developments, I'm joined in Hong Kong by Dr. Marcus Liu, member of the New People's Party in Hong Kong, and in Paris, we're joined by Douglas Yates, professor of politics at the American Graduate School in Paris. Dr. Liu, let's first of all take a look at what the U.S. president said. Trump says he believes that Hong Kong people's freedoms and rights have been taken away. He thinks Hong Kong will no longer be able to compete with free markets, and that a lot of people will be leaving Hong Kong. You have been in Hong Kong your whole life. You've worked over there. How do you look at his remarks?
Yeah, I didn't see his point. I think he just said it in a very exaggerated way. And I see the market is going very smooth, even though today the Hang Seng Index drops for like 500 points. But then, yeah, seems like people are already expecting it, already having some expectations about this kind of, he's going to sign the Autonomy Act. And of course, I don't see a lot of people will leaving Hong Kong, only for maybe, I would say a small number of people.
So,
because the thing is, yeah.
So what is the mood there like? Because this bill sounds like it can be very punishing when it comes to visa restrictions, blocking of the assets of Hong Kong residents.
I
mean, some of them.
Some of them, but I feel like it's more than the Hong Kong government officials who worry about that. But seriously, for the people like me, I am not very worried about the bill. And also, I see there's no point for the U.S. government to intervene the China internal affairs, because this act to me is totally unreasonable.
Why totally unreasonable?
Because again, because the national security law, I mean, enacted by the Chinese government, is China internal affairs. There's nothing really related to the U.S. government. And if you see the bill he signed, the sections that he signed about, like, I mean, stop exporting the sensitive technologies to Hong Kong only. And even though if you see look at the numbers in details about the trading surplus, U.S. is making huge amount of trading surplus to Hong Kong. It's making like 33.4 billions of exports in 2018 and making a surplus of 31 billions. So pretty much I don't see, I mean, the bills is pretty much as is for the marketing of the Donald Trump's campaign in this coming November.
Well, Douglas, in Paris, how do you look at this bill and the fact that President Trump chose to sign this Hong Kong autonomy bill into law right now?
Well, I have mixed feelings. The bill was passed almost uniquely by a bipartisan Congress with unanimity. So there appears to be a lot of support in Washington, D.C. for the sanctions. But on the other hand, there's Donald Trump. And it's problematic because the law is passed, and I've read it very closely from beginning to end, gives a lot of power to the president. In other words, the president will have the power, with his Secretary of State, to identify persons, and with the Secretary of the Treasury, to identify financial institutions. And the president also uniquely has the power to remove those people from sanctions, to waive the sanctions altogether. So it gives a lot of power to the president, and since right now that's Donald Trump, that could be an inducement to corruption. However, if Donald Trump is replaced in the upcoming elections, then it would give a lot of power to Joe Biden. And at that point, I think, and very importantly, it would offer an opportunity to start healing the diplomatic relations between China and the United States, because that is fundamentally what needs to happen.
Right. Let's talk about the specifics of this law. I mean, with regard to the bill, the President of the U.S. shall impose property blocking or visa blocking sanctions on individuals, entities who materially contributed to China's, quote, failure to comply with the joint declaration or the basic law. And also the law says foreign financial institutions who transact with these individuals and entities will be punished. The Department of State shall report to the Congress annually. How broad is the scope that the bill covers?
It's incredibly broad. As you mentioned, it's not only individuals but also financial institutions. It will cover things like doing banking transactions, doing foreign exchange currency transactions, making investments, purchasing property, exporting goods of a defense or joint use technology nature. It would limit loans, credit, being a primary dealer in T-bills. And just to read from Section 5, just a moment, it would prohibit a person from acquiring, holding, withholding, using, transferring, withdrawing, transporting, or exporting any property. In other words, the idea is that the sanctions are complete.
Well, I mean, look at history. I mean, if history is of any guidance, look at America's sanctions on Cuba, on the Latin American countries, on the DPRK, against Iran, for example. Sanctions never worked really the way the politicians intended it to work, right?
Well, right. In other words, sanctions are a tool of foreign policy, but they have to be used intelligently. The United States, for example, imposed sanctions on Russia, but it didn't stop any of Russia's behavior. Crimea has been annexed by Russia. Russia has been supporting a movement within eastern Ukraine. For many years, there were examples of sanctions working. One good example was CAAA against South Africa, against the apartheid regime. But just imposing sanctions, like, say, Iran or Russia or now China, is not sufficient to change behavior. What we need is leadership, negotiations, diplomacy, sensitivity. When Donald Trump went to announce that he had signed this bill, he used it as a campaign platform for his presidential election. It was as if he wasn't speaking to the Chinese people. And what we need more than ever now is for the United States government to be speaking to the Chinese government about these issues and not doing domestic politics with it.
Well, apparently Washington stopped it didn't show any willingness to talk to the Chinese officials as of yet. Marcus in Hong Kong, let me go to you. How do you think this law might affect the Hong Kong politicians who, for example, have properties or need to travel to the U.S. on a regular basis?
So far, for the politicians that I know in Hong Kong, didn't seem like, I mean, to fly to U.S. regularly, unless some officials, to me, as I really care about is, I mean, for this act, I mean, for politicians, they shouldn't be scared because all the politicians, like the council's members, are all elected by the people of Hong Kong. If the U.S. government decide to putting some sanctions on those politicians, which means that they're, it's kind of quite offensive to the Hong Kong people's vote, right? I mean, because our councils are all elected by the Hong Kong people, most of them, and even for those government officials, some of them is quite respectful by by the Hong Kong people. And I don't see, seriously, I don't see the national security law is that so-called scary at all. And it's a must because, again, this is China internal affairs.
And do you feel like somehow Hong Kong, by that definition, Taiwan as well has been used as a pawn in Washington's, geopolitical games as well as, out of its domestic electoral considerations?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. I think so, definitely, because you will see there's elections going to be. especially for this law, for this act, I think it's purely for Donald Trump's campaign's strategy.
Right,
Yeah.
that would be unfortunate. Well, Marcus in Paris, Douglas in Paris, do you share Marcus's assessment?
Yeah. It's one of several issues that has been evolving, a potential conflict brewing between the rising power of China in the South China Sea, in the question of Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in the Uyghurs, all of these different issues. And it's so important to listen to the Chinese government and not to hastily begin a conflict. We're major trading partners. Each of the economies depends on one another. We can find common ground. And so if we were to listen to each other's side on Hong Kong, if we listen to Chinese concerns, the Chinese concern is sovereignty, that its sovereignty over Hong Kong be recognized. And if you read the law that was just signed, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, it explicitly recognizes Chinese sovereignty. So if we have a different president in the United States, he could be messaging that. He could be saying, we recognize Chinese sovereignty. On the other hand, the law says we support autonomy. Well, why? What's the U.S. got to do with that? So the United States has a lot of concerns about this coming century, its major trading partner, concerns of intellectual property, of tariffs, of trade, budget deficits, and so its concerns are that its property interests will be protected. And I think the word democracy in the U.S.-China relationship is problematic. And if you could read between the lines, you'd see the word democracy and the support for democracy is largely a language for protecting property rights, protecting established relations with an entrepot whose location next to a market of 1.4 billion consumers is clearly an inducement for continued trade.
Well, what you're talking about reminds me of American administration's war on Cuba. It's banana factories, it's tobacco industry, Hilton hotels over there. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcus Liu, member of Hong Kong's New People's Party, and Douglas Yates, professor of politics at the American Graduate School in Paris.